Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I'd like to start us off with a bit of a potentially controversial subject. The shared responsibility model for cloud security is broken. So, who am I and why should you listen to me tell you that? My name's Matthew Fuller. I'm a cloud security engineer. I've been working primarily in AWS environments, but also Azure and GCP as well. And I've helped startups and large enterprises alike move their infrastructure into the cloud and keep it secure. I'm also the founder of a cloud security company in the configuration monitoring space that was acquired last year. And as part of that, I've had a front row seat to some of the worst cloud security configurations. I think that most of us can probably agree that the state of cloud security today is pretty terrible. It seems that there's not a week that goes by without another high profile security incident leading directly to loss of customer data that is a result of misconfiguration in the cloud. I don't think it's your fault, at least not all of it. You folks have done some strange and quite frankly, very insecure things in the cloud, and companies have paid the price for that. But under the hood, fundamentally, I think there's a much deeper problem at play. And it goes back to the shared responsibility model. Now, don't get me wrong, the cloud providers have done a fantastic job of security of the cloud, securing their stuff. And they've also done a decent job of giving us as cloud developers the tools that we need to be secure in the cloud. But I believe that therein lies the problem, because more and more, this model is growing very imbalanced. In the early days of the cloud, this model more or less made sense, right? There were only a handful of configurations and services and APIs that we need to be concerned about as cloud security teams, or probably at the time it was more realistically the IT department. But over time, it has grown. And over the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen a dramatic uptick in the number of unique cloud services across all of the major cloud providers, over 900% in the last 6 to 7 years alone. And if you've looked at the services menu for any of these big cloud providers and you've gone into the UI, you've probably noticed that this list of services just keeps growing and growing by the day across all lines of business. In fact, they've added scroll bars to this menu recently because there's just simply too many services to fit on a single page. All of these services in combination with the regions in which they operate, there's 13 or 40 different regions or locations, and all of the configurations and interplay between those configurations, and mixing in 10 or 100 or 1,000 different cloud developers and engineers make it pretty impossible, especially manually, but I would argue even from an automated standpoint, to keep track of everything that's going on in your cloud environments. And this problem, this issue, leads to security breaches. Lots and lots of security breaches. And despite our best efforts as an industry, these breaches show no sign of slowing down. But what keeps happening behind the scenes? We continue to see more complexity, more services, more configuration options for those services, and more costs, both financial and human capital costs and training costs as well. And I think we need to ask ourselves as an industry, are more security services truly the solution to this problem? There's already scores of first-party services that exist inside of the cloud environments. There's a whole industry of other third-party services as well to help solve these problems. One of my favorite examples of sort of configuration inception, if you will, there is a service inside of AWS called the AWS config service. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the config service is responsible for managing and monitoring the configurations of other services in AWS. But like any good AWS service, it itself requires configuration. And it's very easy to get into a state in which the configuration service is not properly configured and therefore can't monitor the configuration of other services. And so you almost need a config service for the config service, but at that point, it's just config services all the way down the stack. And as an industry, we're grasping at straws here, right? We're spending billions of dollars just to monitor the state of our security configurations in the cloud. And that's only going to continue to increase over the next years and decades. And so I'd argue that this shared responsibility model has become more and more and continues to be very imbalanced, skewing towards the direction of the cloud users and the security teams that are responsible for maintaining this configuration inside of the cloud. It's time for us as an industry to rethink this model because clearly something isn't working here. Now, I recognize that this model is not going to change overnight, right? It's entrenched in almost everything that we do as cloud developers. And unfortunately, a lot of what's required to shift this mindset and to shift this burden rests on the shoulders of the cloud providers themselves. And so I'd like to structure the second part of this conversation in two main ways. The first is a wish list of sorts of areas where I think the cloud providers are trending in the right direction, but that we need to see more of. And the second part are ways that we can fight back as cloud developers today, both from a business and a technical standpoint. So let's start out with the wish list to the cloud providers. What I want to do here is highlight areas where I think we're doing well, areas where we're starting to see the right trends and that I want to see more of and see us heading in the better direction. First, let's talk about consolidation of security services. I showed the slide earlier that has all of these different security products, and now I recognize that they do different things. But I think the point is that there's this sprawl of configuration and services and dashboards and APIs and policies that we as developers need to be concerned about when we deal with security services in the cloud. We need to reduce this number of dashboards, especially within the same cloud provider, and make it easier for our cloud developers to work directly in the cloud. An area where I think, and a cloud provider that I think is starting to show signs of doing the right thing here is Microsoft Azure. They have the Security Center product, which is consolidating all of your different compliance controls and security policies into a single interface. And I don't think we're 100% of the way here yet. There's still this sprawl of other configurations that we need to be concerned about. But it's starting to teach cloud developers that we have a single unified dashboard and a single unified place that we can go to get answers about security questions. The second key area for the cloud providers themselves is security by default. And what I mean by this is not that the security products and the security services that the providers are offering are insecure, but rather that I hate the fact that we have so many different security options in the cloud that are buried under layers of checkboxes and expansion menus and sort of treated as sort of second-class citizens behind the scenes that we need to go and turn on as developers. And the consequence of that is that they never get turned on. Providers need to start providing a baseline of security controls that are turned on across the board. And if you want to have the flexibility and turn on additional controls, you can. One provider that I think is doing a decent job of this is Google Cloud Platform. Within GCP, you kind of get across the board a number of different services that are turned on by default when you start a new account and you turn on a new project. In fact, for one of their services, the admin activity logs, their documentation explicitly states admin activity logs are always written. You can't configure or disable them. And that's the kind of thinking and the mindset that I think the providers need to be in when it comes to delivering these security services to developers. In another area, they also disable access to new services and new APIs that you don't need by default out of the box. And that has the added benefit of decreasing and reducing the scope and the surface area that our security teams need to monitor for. And finally, I believe that the best security features are ones that are integrated directly into the products that they support. If you think about it, companies are not moving to the cloud because they want to use security services, right? They're moving to the cloud because they want to use storage or compute or application services. And security services just kind of come along for the ride. They're things that we have to use because we need to in order to keep our environment safe. But under the hood, developers are not clamoring to use security services. And so I think that the best place for these services is directly integrated into the products in which they support. A good example of this is Amazon Web Services S3 console. I think everyone in the industry at this point is familiar with the S3 bucket problem. It's been on the news, constantly over the last several years. And even though AWS is not technically at fault here, they gave us all of the tools that we needed to secure these buckets properly. Something happened and mistakes were still being made and resulted in loss of data and breaches. And so what they've started doing inside of the console is they've added UI elements and callouts directly into the S3 console. Because if I'm a developer, I'm not going to Security Hub or Config Service or Guard Duty or any of these other places to get information about my S3 buckets. I'm going to the S3 console. And so the point is that this is just a start. We need to take this mindset and this model and expand it across all of our other services as well. EC2, VPC console, IAM. We've talked a lot about IAM today and how it's so difficult for users to do it the right way. If we can start integrating security controls directly into the IAM console, that will have a drastically beneficial impact on our cloud developers. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about ways that we can fight back as cloud developers and decision makers in the cloud. There are both business and technical changes that are going to need to be made. And although there are things that we'll talk about in a little bit on the technical side and specific controls that we can implement, a lot of what's required to shift this mindset in the industry happens on the business and the relationship side. Specifically, I think that we need to begin considering the cost of cloud security much earlier and more often in the cloud development lifecycle. We also need to hold our cloud provider partners accountable for the services and the tools that they're releasing. And I believe that we need to fully and completely rethink the way that we're doing developer training at organizations today. I think that there's a lot more places where we need to consider this cost of security and how it impacts the organization as a whole. All the way from the earliest parts of evaluating the cloud providers themselves through releasing and expanding on new services, training your developers, and using new services as they're announced by the cloud providers. If you are so fortunate to be in a position today where you're evaluating a move from the traditional data center or some other environment into the cloud, you have the opportunity to take advantage of years of different security maturity across the major cloud providers that companies that are currently in the cloud and chose to move to the cloud years ago aren't able to do. And you can use that as a competitive advantage. You can take advantage of that to evaluate the security controls that the clouds are offering and ask detailed and important questions around the billing model, the minimum spend requirements, the breadth and depth of the security offerings that your providers are using. In any organization, regardless of how your engineering and your security teams are structured, it's critical that these teams communicate early and often during the development phase. I often see this kind of model where security and engineering teams function as entirely separate entities within the organization. And the engineering team builds something and they kind of do a cost analysis themselves and a security analysis themselves, and then they deploy it to production. And then only weeks or months later does the security team come back and evaluate it and come up with a list of things that need to be fixed. But it's never going to get fixed at that point because the service is already in production and it has production traffic and users. And so those issues just become Jira tickets and they never get fixed. When it comes to developer training, I think that it's time for an overhaul here as well. I think that the industry, the cloud industry specifically, is significantly behind. And I've seen a lot of companies where they have this annual security training that's required for their developers. Usually it's part of some compliance program like PCI or HIPAA or some promise that they've made to their customers that they do this on an annual basis. But it usually centers around web application vulnerabilities or secure coding practices, and it never touches on cloud risk and cloud security. And yet the purview of those developers has changed dramatically over the last 5 to 6 years. Instead of just being web application developers, they're now web application developers that are developing products that interact with the cloud provider APIs and need to consider the security concerns and the cost there as well. So we need to overhaul and rethink this model as an industry if we're going to remain secure as we move into the cloud. When it comes to new services, look, I'm like any other cloud developer, right? I go to reInvent and these big industry conferences and they announce 20 or 30 new services and I want to go and turn them all on in production the day one. But I think as security teams, we need to take a step back and evaluate these new services as they exist within our security model. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about technical controls in a minute. But we need to properly evaluate those controls, come up with a list of best practices, known good configurations, and then release them sort of into the wild for our developers. As you can imagine, the cost model for security services in the cloud is just as complex as any other service in the cloud. And so I put together this chart that shows all of the main auditing and configuration monitoring and logging services that the big cloud providers offer. And I think it highlights just how important it is to understand how these various services are going to scale for your organization as you add more and more developers and more services. Some of them have a very generous free tier and then they become very, very expensive very quickly. Some of them have 30-day trials and then switch into a per request model. And this is the kind of thing that not only does your security organization need to understand, but your developers need to understand this as well, because the controls that they're releasing and the projects that they're deploying are going to have a direct impact on the costs that are borne by your security organization. When it comes to working with the cloud providers, we need to remember that we're the consumers here. You wouldn't, for example, buy an alarm system from a manufacturer that installed the control panel in the basement and required a 26-digit PIN to activate it. Why? Because you'd never turn it on, and you'd leave the house without activating it every single day, and it would defeat the purpose of having the alarm system in the first place. That's kind of a bit of an extreme example, but it shows and proves the point that security services need to be easy to use and tightly integrated, or else they're never going to be turned on. And you can raise these points and requirements in lots of different ways. These are just a few, but we're fortunate to be in a cloud landscape today that is extremely competitive. We have tons of companies talking about moving to multi-cloud, trying to avoid vendor lock-in. Use that to your advantage. Pit the cloud providers against each other, not just on their technical capabilities, but their security and their cost capabilities as well. So let's shift gears and talk about some of the technical recommendations and technical controls that we can implement today. Most of these come down to reducing our attack surface and making these configurations easier to audit. I would estimate that very few companies are actually using every single region or location that's available to them in the cloud. I think Azure has something like 46 locations, AWS has 13 or 14. If you're not using it, turn it off. It's as simple as that. It's the easiest way to reduce your attack surface and the scope of what your security teams are responsible for monitoring. All of the major cloud providers have very easy ways to do this. You can use location policies, you can use IAM conditions, enforce those at the org level, push them out to your member accounts. And I've also noticed that some cloud providers have started doing this by default, whereas new regions are announced, they're disabling the access to those regions first, and then you have to go and turn them on. And I think that's a behavior that we should encourage. In the same vein, we should use policies that enforce an allow list of services. Chances are your engineering and your development teams are not launching satellites into space, and so they probably don't need access to services like AWS Ground Station. So again, if you're not using it, turn it off. Use the policies to enforce explicit list of services that your security teams have vetted, come up with known best practices for, and then deploy those out to the organization after you've established that baseline. And if your cloud organization accounts are not centrally managed, then you've lost control of the security provisioning and auditing process. Any policy that you enforce here is going to be useless if your developers are spinning up AWS accounts or Azure subscriptions and paying for them with a credit card that they get reimbursed for later. Similarly, if your developers are still logging into the Cloud Console and doing sort of this, what I call point and click development model, you've lost the ability to audit the security configurations before they're actually deployed in production. Infrastructure as code solves a lot of problems. We looked at some of them today, but from a security perspective, it allows you to define the required configurations in that sort of known good state that your security teams can define before the service ever makes its way into production. And you can implement and audit these controls way earlier in the release pipeline. There's a lot of tools that can help you do this in the open source space, regardless of whether you're using CloudFormation, Terraform, ARM templates. It doesn't matter. There's lots of tools to help out. One of them was actually just released a few weeks ago that I'm very impressed with so far. It's called CloudFormation Guard. It's from AWS, and it allows you to define sort of security rules in the format of firewall rules. And you can then audit your policy, your templates, your CloudFormation templates in a CI/CD pipeline for specific policies that your organization requires before it ever makes its way out into production. But regardless of how you do it, the configurations that you implement need to be done and need to be checked before they make their way out into production. Otherwise, they're never going to get fixed. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I recognize this is a controversial topic, especially from the perspective of the cloud providers, right? They've said, we've given you all of the tools. Why can't you just use them properly? And two of the big arguments that I've heard around this space is that the cloud isn't for beginners. If you're a company and you've chosen to go into the cloud, you have a responsibility to your users to implement things securely and to continually audit those controls. And the other is that the implementation of cloud services is really just a set of Lego blocks, right? And building blocks. And if you as a developer want to do the wrong thing, it's entirely your prerogative. And I don't disagree with those arguments. I'm not trying to absolve us as developers of responsibility entirely. I just think that we need to make things a little bit easier to use and a little bit harder to do the wrong thing. And if as an industry we can implement even some of what we talked about here today, I'm confident that we can shift from this shared responsibility model back to a much more balanced responsibility model while still maintaining the flexibility that the cloud's famous for. So please follow me here on these links on social media. I'm writing about these kinds of topics, very passionate about them. Thank you for listening. Thank you to the organizers of the conference today. Really appreciate having the opportunity to talk. I'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Matt. So I think the first question is, what do you think should be included with the cost of cloud storage services? So specifically, DLP comes at a pretty high cost, but should that service be considered part of the default baseline?
Yeah, so I understand that the service costs for the provider are going to be a significant decision in whether things should be turned on by default or not. I think when it comes to DLP, you start to get into the area where it's consuming significant resources under the hood. My focus has primarily been is more on the configuration of simple services by default, kind of out of the gate. So when you think about services like encryption at rest or in transit, and you look at a lot of services in GCP, for example, they've kind of given you that across the board. They've said, look, we just recognize that this is going to be a checkbox for everybody, and so we want to turn it on everywhere. But then there's some services in AWS, and they've started to change this. But if you look at some of their older services where you turn it on, you still have to go 7 layers deep into menu options in order to turn on something simple like encryption. And I think that's one where from the cloud provider's perspective, they need to ask themselves, is the risk of not having this, does that outweigh the cost that it's going to impact of us if there's a high profile breach? Because don't forget that it's the cloud providers' names that are right there sort of in the news articles along with whatever company was compromised when there are incidents. And it's not just encryption, but it's public access controls, security group access, default access for some of their simpler like application services. It's across the board.
Thanks. Question from Fernando. What do you see as the role for managed service providers? And he asks, shouldn't developers go to them if the native services are too complex? But I would add, different industries have different needs for security baselines. Wouldn't there be a role for managed service providers or other VAR type actors who set configuration by default to what a specific industry or a specific type of customer would need?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that what has happened a lot in the cloud is you see sort of a hodgepodge of different requirements and services come out. And then you have MSPs and other third-party platforms fill in the gaps of where the cloud providers are not doing a good job. You see this with logging services, with security services are no exception. And I think that the role for those MSPs is not removed. I'm not advocating for a removal of MSPs here, because I think there's always going to be specific requirements that don't make sense by default. Maybe it doesn't make sense to have isolated tenant requirements for every single instance that you deploy in AWS, but HIPAA requires that. And so it comes with an added cost. And those are areas where I think you can engage with an MSP and really get the benefit of understanding what these additional compliance programs have, whether it's multi-region requirements because of GDPR or the multi-tenant requirements I talked about with HIPAA. There's certainly a need for those, but I think that out of the box, we should still get a baseline set of requirements that can be used and universally applicable across all of these services.
No, that makes sense. And then how do you think about the evolution of that baseline through time? So you bring up the example of ground station, which is something that AWS adds that probably most customers don't need by default. But in response, I think of the S3 block access APIs, which were a change, but one that you might want to have on by default. So how should cloud providers balance the evolution of their systems with the need to maintain both backward compatibility and ideally ever increasing security?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think at a high level, this is a very complex topic when you start to get into intricacies of specific services. But I think that at a high level, if the added new configuration or new control extends or enhances the security of the product, then it should be added by default. If it's something that, and again, I'm speaking in very generic terms here because there's lots of under the hood intricacies, but if it's something that it's simply a new service or a new feature, I think that that's something where, and GCP has done this a lot, but you turn it off by default and allow the users to opt into it. I don't think it should be just disabled globally and never be able to be turned on, because that defeats this model of the cloud where you can just start pulling things in and using them as you see fit. But I think it's up to security teams to turn off some of those newer, potentially less vetted features until they get to a state where they properly come up with a baseline set of controls and requirements for their organization, and then they can turn it on as they see fit. So I think to sum it all up, push that decision making back to the organizations that are implementing it rather than having it be made by the cloud providers.
All right, and I'll ask one more question from Darren on Slack, who says, security teams have a bad reputation for saying no, so not allowing teams to use the console to launch resources would not be well received. Are there patterns you would advocate for that are balanced between disallowing anything but infrastructure as code and the Wild West, things that enable learning but still maintain a good security bar?
Yeah, so I think that in sandbox and dev and maybe staging environments, depending on your setup, I would not go as far as mandating infrastructure as code. And again, this is an organizational decision. It's not something you can just do lightly, overnight. But I think that if you are in a production environment and you're not deploying resources as infrastructure as code, you need a significant kind of added layer to the security onion in order to help make up for that loss. So I recognize, infrastructure as code is not for everyone. Not everyone's going to do it. But if you're in an environment where developers are going into production and they're clicking and deploying services in that way, then you need to have sufficient controls in addition to what you already have to help monitor for that and check. If something is deployed out of band, how will I know? What are my approved allow listed IP addresses? What's the list of API calls that we expect versus one that may be, suspicious?
Cool. Well, thank you, Matthew. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in 4 minutes with Paul Schwarzenberger on centralizing identity across AWS, Azure, and GCP. Thanks, Matthew.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.